March 15, 1979, Beverly Hills. Charles Bronson had buried his wife 3 weeks ago. Producer Martin Kellner thought that made him vulnerable. Kellner leaned back in his leather chair, wine-drunk and smirking. "At least now you can find a woman who won't die on you mid-career, Charlie." The restaurant went silent. Waiters froze. Even the kitchen stopped clattering. Bronson didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small envelope. "Open it," Bronson said quietly. Inside were photographs, medical records, bank transfers, evidence that would destroy 3 careers and send 2 men to prison. Kellner's face drained of color as he realized what he was looking at. The night Hollywood learned that mocking Charles Bronson's dead wife was the last mistake you'd ever make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hook. The marble floors of Kellerman's Mulholland Drive mansion gleamed under crystal chandeliers as Vincent followed his host through the crowd. Each step echoed with the weight of 15 years of preparation. The other guests, directors, agents, studio executives, parted like water, their conversations resuming in hushed tones behind them. Vincent had memorized every detail of this house, from architectural magazines, property records, and a brief tour 3 years ago during another industry gathering. The layout, the exits, the security system that Kellerman bragged about to anyone who'd listen. Tonight, all that research would matter. "Beautiful home, Marcus." Vincent's voice carried the same steady calm that had unnerved stunt coordinators and leading men throughout his career. "I particularly admire the isolation." Kellerman's laugh came out strangled. "Vinny, look, if I said something that—" "You did." Vincent stopped walking, forcing Kellerman to turn and face him. Around them, the party continued its careful choreography of networking and cocaine-fueled deal-making, but their little bubble had gone cold. "You mentioned my wife. You called her a drunk." The producer's face flushed red above his designer collar. Marcus Kellerman had built an empire on exploitation films and tax shelters, but he'd never learned when to stop talking. "Jesus Christ, Vincent, it was a joke. Everyone knows you've been washed up since Elena died." Vincent's interruption was surgical. "Yes, I'm aware of the timeline. What I'm curious about is your sudden interest in her memory." Kellerman glanced around, noting how conversations had died within a 10-foot radius. The smart money in Hollywood knew Vincent Bronson's reputation preceded his fall from grace. Before he'd become a bottom feeder producing direct-to-video thrillers, he'd been the stuntman who'd put 3 actors in the hospital and ended 2 careers with his bare hands. The official reports always cited accidents during filming. "Look, maybe we should talk privately?" Vincent's smile was warm, grandfatherly even. "I thought you'd never ask." The walk to Kellerman's study felt like a funeral procession. Vincent cataloged details with the precision that had once made him legendary. The Rothko on the wall worth more than most people's houses, the imported Italian leather furniture, the wet bar stocked with bottles older than some of the starlets downstairs. All of it paid for by bottom feeding off other people's desperation. Kellerman closed the door and immediately moved behind his desk, putting furniture between them. Smart man. "Vincent, I don't know what you think you're—" "I think I'm having a conversation with the man who just publicly mocked my dead wife." Vincent settled into the chair across from the desk, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Elena Bronson, killed by a drunk driver on Sunset Boulevard, October 15, 2004. At least, that's what the papers said." The color drained from Kellerman's face. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "It means I've been waiting 15 years for someone to give me an excuse." Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small digital recorder, placing it gently on the mahogany desktop. "Tonight you volunteered. Are you threatening me? In my own house?" "I don't make threats, Marcus. I make promises." Vincent leaned back, completely at ease. "The promise I made over Elena's grave was very specific. Anyone who dishonored her memory would learn exactly what kind of man they were dealing with." Kellerman's hand moved toward his desk drawer. Probably where he kept a gun, Vincent mused. Most of these Hollywood tough guys did. You're insane if you think you can just walk in here and... And what? Have a civil conversation about respect for the dead? Vincent's laugh was genuinely amused. Marcus, I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to educate you. About what? About the night Elena really died. Vincent pressed play on the recorder. About what happens when a man reaches his breaking point, and about why some secrets stay buried for 15 years. The device crackled to life, and Elena's voice filled the room, young, angry, alive. The recording was poor quality, clearly made on old equipment, but her words were crystal clear. You can't keep doing this, Vincent. The drinking, the violence, the lies. I won't let you destroy us both. Kellerman's hand froze halfway to the drawer. Where did you get that? I made it. Vincent's voice had gone flat, emotionless. October 15th, 2004, 3 hours before the car accident that wasn't an accident. The study's soundproofing was excellent. Vincent had researched that too. No one downstairs could hear Elena's voice growing more desperate, more frightened. No one could hear the sound of furniture breaking, or Vincent's own voice, younger and slurred with alcohol, shouting back. Jesus Christ, Kellerman whispered. He wasn't taking calls that night, Vincent replied, reaching over to stop the recording. But you're going to wish he had been. Outside, the Hollywood Hills stretched into darkness, and 300 industry insiders continued their party, unaware that in a soundproof study above them, the night's real entertainment was just beginning. The silence that followed Elena's voice was absolute. Vincent watched Kellerman's face cycle through confusion, fear, and something approaching comprehension. The producer's hand trembled as it retreated from the desk drawer, fingers leaving damp prints on the mahogany surface. I don't understand, Kellerman whispered, but his eyes suggested otherwise. Vincent ejected the small cassette from the digital player, holding it up to catch the amber light from the desk lamp. The plastic case was worn smooth from years of handling, its edges softened like a worry stone. This was in our bedroom dresser for 13 years before I finally had the courage to play it. Elena had hidden it behind her jewelry box, the one with the broken clasp that she never let me fix. The memory pulled him backward through time. Their Laurel Canyon bungalow had been modest compared to this monument to excess, but it had been theirs. Elena's paintings covering the walls where expensive art now hung, her books scattered across every surface, the morning light streaming through windows she'd insisted on keeping uncurtained, because she said darkness bred secrets. She was painting again that fall, Vincent continued, his voice taking on the cadence of confession. Watercolors mostly, landscapes that looked nothing like Los Angeles. Rolling hills and farmhouses, places we'd never been but talked about visiting when my stunt work slowed down. He paused, feeling the familiar ache behind his sternum. She never got to see those places. Kellerman had gone very still, the kind of stillness Vincent recognized from film sets just before someone got hurt. Vincent, maybe you should... Should what? Stop talking about my wife? Vincent's laugh held no warmth. You started this conversation downstairs, Marcus. Called her a drunk in front of 300 people. Said I'd been crying into my whiskey about some dead broad for 15 years. The words tasted like copper in his mouth. Interesting choice of phrase, considering you weren't even at her funeral. But that wasn't entirely true. Vincent closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the rain-soaked cemetery, the handful of mourners, the way Elena's sister had refused to meet his gaze. Someone had been there, watching from beneath a black umbrella near the entrance gates. He'd assumed it was a reporter. There had been a few stories about the tragic accident, the stuntman's wife killed by a drunk driver on her way home from an art gallery opening. The truth was always more complicated than the headlines. The thing about guilt, Vincent said, opening his eyes to find Kellerman still frozen behind his desk, is how it changes shape over time. At first it's sharp, cuts you every time you breathe. Then it gets heavy, settles in your chest like a tumor. But eventually, if you're patient, it hardens into something useful, something you can build on. He thought about the 15 years that had followed Elena's death. The slow descent from A-list stunt coordinator to B-movie producer. The careful construction of a public persona, the broken-down has-been, the widower who'd never recovered from his loss. It had been easier than he'd expected, letting people see only what they wanted to see. Hollywood was full of men who'd peaked early and spent their remaining years chasing ghosts, but Vincent had been chasing something else entirely. "I sold the house in Laurel Canyon 2 months after the funeral," he said. "Couldn't stand being surrounded by her things. Her easel in the corner, still holding that last painting she never finished. A self-portrait, but the eyes—" He trailed off, remembering how Elena's painted eyes had followed him around the room, accusing and sad. "I kept very little. Some photographs, her wedding ring, and this recording once I found it." The cassette felt warm in his palm now, as if Elena's voice had left some residual heat in the plastic. He'd played it hundreds of times over the years, each listening revealing new details, new layers of meaning. The tremor in her voice when she'd said his name. The sound of their dog whimpering in the background. Rex, the golden retriever who disappeared the night she died. The exact moment when fear had crept into her tone, when she'd realized that this fight was different from all the others. "She was going to leave me," Vincent said simply. "Had already packed a bag, hidden it in her studio. I found it later, along with the recorder she'd been using to document my behavior. Insurance, she called it. Evidence for the divorce attorney she'd already contacted." Kellerman's breathing had gone shallow. "Why are you telling me this?" Vincent smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features into something almost paternal. "Because, Marcus, you're going to help me understand something that's been bothering me for 15 years. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "How did you know she was drunk that night when the police report said otherwise?" The question hung in the soundproofed air like smoke, and Vincent watched as the last traces of color drained from Marcus Kellerman's face. Kellerman's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, no sound emerging. Vincent let the silence stretch, watching sweat bead along the producer's hairline despite the study's perfect climate control. 15 years of questions were about to find their answers. "I never said," Kellerman began, but his voice cracked on the words. "You did." Vincent's tone remained conversational, almost gentle. "Downstairs, when you called her a drunk." "But Marcus, here's what's fascinating about that particular insult." He placed the cassette recorder carefully back on the desk, positioning it like a chess piece. "The official police report states Elena was completely sober when she died. Blood alcohol level 0. The toxicology report was clean except for a small amount of prescription anxiety medication, well within therapeutic levels." Kellerman's hand had found a silver letter opener on his desk, gripping it like a talisman. "I must have misspoken. People talk, you know how rumors—" "People do talk," Vincent agreed. "But this wasn't a rumor, was it? You spoke with such certainty, such specificity." He reached into his jacket's inner pocket, withdrawing a manila envelope yellowed with age. "I've had 15 years to think about that night, Marcus. 15 years to piece together inconsistencies." The envelope's contents scattered across the mahogany surface like tarot cards revealing an unwelcome future. Police photographs, newspaper clippings, medical examiner reports, and beneath them all, a single sheet of letterhead that made Kellerman's face go ashen. "Kellerman Productions, Incorporated," Vincent read from the letterhead. "Dated October 16, 2004. One day after Elena's death." He held up the document, and Kellerman could see his own signature at the bottom, though the text remained hidden. "Would you like to know what this says, Marcus? Or would you prefer to tell me yourself?" The letter opener clattered to the desktop as Kellerman's hand went limp. "Vincent, I swear to God, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Vincent's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, the tone he'd once used to direct actors through their most dangerous stunts. Calm authority that brooked no argument. Because according to this letter, Kellerman Productions paid Elena Bronson $15,000 on the day she died. A consulting fee, the paperwork says. "For what consultation, Marcus?" The question hit like a physical blow. Kellerman stumbled backward, his chair rolling into the bookshelf behind him. Ancient first editions trembled on their shelves, a library bought by the yard to impress visitors, most of the volumes never opened. "That's impossible," Kellerman stammered. We never—" "The check was cashed," Vincent continued relentlessly, producing a photocopied bank record. Elena's signature, deposited into her personal account at 11:30 a.m., October 15th, 3 hours before our final argument, 7 hours before she got in her car and drove into that concrete barrier on Sunset. Vincent stood slowly, his movements deliberate and predatory. The years had been kind to his physical conditioning. Even at 58, he moved with the controlled grace that had made him legendary in an industry built on controlled violence. "Here's what I think happened," he said, beginning to pace the room's perimeter. Each step was measured, calculated to keep Kellerman off balance. "I think someone hired my wife to gather information about me. Someone who knew about my drinking, my temper, my history of accidents on set. Someone who thought a recording of me at my worst might be valuable." Kellerman's denial died on his lips as Vincent produced another document from the envelope. This one was older, the paper brittle with age. An insurance policy application, stamped and notarized. $2 million, Vincent read. Accidental death benefit on Elena Bronson's life, purchased 6 months before she died. But here's the interesting part, Marcus. I wasn't the beneficiary. The blood drained from Kellerman's face so completely that Vincent wondered if the man might actually faint. But shock gave way to something else in the producer's eyes, recognition. And beneath that, the first glimmer of genuine fear. "The policy was held in trust," Vincent continued, "administered by a shell company that took me 8 years to trace back to its real owners. 8 years of hiring private investigators, bribing court clerks, following paper trails through offshore banks and dummy corporations." He smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered features into something terrible. "Guess whose name was buried at the end of that particular rainbow?" Kellerman's office suddenly felt smaller, the soundproofing that had seemed like luxury now closing in like a coffin. The party continued 3 floors below, but they might have been on the moon for all the help it could provide. "She was working for you," Vincent said simply. "Elena was your spy, gathering evidence of my instability. Insurance for some plan I'm only beginning to understand." He leaned across the desk, close enough that Kellerman could smell the whiskey on his breath, the same brand he'd been drinking the night Elena died. "The question is, Marcus, did you know she wouldn't live to spend your money?" Outside, Los Angeles glittered in the darkness, and somewhere in the hills, a siren wailed. Kellerman's mouth worked soundlessly, opening and closing like a man drowning in air. The siren outside grew closer, its wail cutting through the mansion's expensive insulation before fading into the canyon below. Vincent watched the producer's face cycle through denial, calculation, and something approaching panic. "You're insane," Kellerman finally whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Elena would never. She loved you, Vincent. Everyone knew that." "Did she?" Vincent settled back into his chair, the picture of calm reasonableness. "Because that recording suggests otherwise. Would you like to hear more of it, the part where she talks about being afraid to come home? About sleeping with a chair wedged under the bedroom door?" The producer's hand fumbled for his phone, but Vincent's voice stopped him cold. "I wouldn't do that, Marcus. Not unless you want to explain to the police why you're in possession of evidence from a 15-year-old case they never properly investigated." Vincent's smile was grandfatherly, warm. "Besides, we're just having a conversation between old friends. We were never friends." "No," Vincent agreed. "But we had something in common, didn't we? An interest in Elena's well-being, though your methods were certainly more creative than mine." Kellerman was sweating freely now, despite the room's perfect climate control. "I don't know what kind of sick game this is, but—" "Game?" Vincent laughed, the sound genuine and terrifying. "Marcus, this isn't a game. This is therapy. 15 years of unresolved grief, finally finding its proper outlet." The producer lurched to his feet, backing toward the study's French doors that led to a private balcony. "People know where I am. If something happens to me—" "Something already happened to you," Vincent said quietly. "The moment you mentioned Elena's name downstairs. The moment you revealed you knew things about that night that were never made public." Kellerman's back hit the glass doors with a soft thump. "I made a mistake. I misspoke. People talk, and after 15 years details get confused." "The insurance investigator was very thorough," Vincent interrupted. pulling another document from his seemingly endless envelope. Apparently, accidental death policies require extensive documentation, especially when the beneficiary is a corporate entity rather than a spouse. The paper trembled in Vincent's weathered hands, but his voice remained steady. According to this report, Elena had been acting erratically in the weeks before her death, asking unusual questions about my work, my finances, my past incidents on set, almost as if she was gathering information for someone. Kellerman's breathing had gone shallow and rapid. "Vincent, listen to me. Whatever you think you know, I know my wife made 3 phone calls the night she died," Vincent continued, his tone conversational. "The police record shows them clearly. One to her sister. That was the call where she said she was leaving me. One to a divorce attorney who'd agreed to meet with her the following week." He paused, letting the implications settle. "And one 20-minute call to a number registered to Kellerman Productions." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the party sounds from below seemed to have faded, as if the entire mansion was holding its breath. "You spoke to her that night," Vincent said. 20 minutes, starting at 7:43 p.m. "Want to tell me what you discussed?" Kellerman's face had gone gray, the color of old concrete. I can't remember every business call from 15 years ago." "Business call," Vincent repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you called it when you told her to bring you the recording? When you explained how much more valuable it would be as leverage against me rather than evidence in a divorce proceeding?" The producer's knees buckled, and he slid down the glass door until he was sitting on the Persian rug, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with sweat. It was supposed to be simple, insurance, a safety net. Vincent's expression never changed, but something deadly shifted behind his eyes. "Insurance against what, Marcus?" "You," Kellerman whispered. "Your reputation, the accidents." People were starting to ask questions about the stunts that went wrong, the actors who got hurt. She was going to be our witness. Someone on the inside who could testify about your drinking, your temper. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Vincent nodded slowly, as if Kellerman had simply confirmed something he'd long suspected. "So you recruited my wife to spy on me," he said. "Paid her to document my worst moments. And when she decided to leave me instead of destroying me, you convinced her that the recording could serve both purposes: evidence for her divorce and ammunition for your crusade." Kellerman's head dropped into his hands. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She was just supposed to deliver the tape and disappear, start over somewhere far away. "But she never made it to that meeting, did she?" Vincent asked softly. "Because 20 minutes after she hung up with you, Elena Bronson drove her car into a concrete barrier at 60 miles per hour. Outside, another siren wailed in the distance, and Vincent wondered idly if it was coming for them. Middle development. Vincent let the confession settle between them like dust from a collapsed building. Kellerman remained crumpled against the glass door, his expensive suit wrinkled beyond any tailor's redemption, while somewhere in the depths of the mansion, the party continued its hollow celebration of an industry built on beautiful lies. "She called me back," Kellerman whispered suddenly, his voice barely audible. "After she hung up. Called me back 10 minutes later, crying." This was new information. Vincent felt something cold unfurl in his chest. Not surprise, but a terrible recognition, like glimpsing your own face in a funhouse mirror. "What did she say?" "She was in her car. I could hear the engine running, hear her crying." Kellerman's hands pressed against his temples as if trying to contain a hemorrhage of memory. "She said she couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't pretend to love you while documenting how much she'd grown to fear you." The words hit Vincent like physical blows, each syllable finding its target with surgical precision. He thought of Elena's face that final morning, how she'd turned away when he'd tried to kiss her goodbye, how she'd flinched when he'd reached past her for the coffee pot, a movement so subtle he'd almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. "She was leaving you," Kellerman continued, his voice gaining strength as if confession was a kind of absolution. "But she was also leaving us. Said she couldn't be party to destroying anyone, even someone she'd stopped loving." Stopped loving. Vincent repeated the words like he was learning a foreign language. "When did that happen, Marcus? When did my wife stop loving me and start working for you?" Kellerman's laugh was bitter, broken. You really don't know, do you? You have no idea what you became. Vincent's hands clenched involuntarily, the motion so automatic, he wondered if Elena had seen this exact gesture, this exact warning sign in those final weeks. Tell me. The drinking wasn't new. The temper wasn't new. But the combination. Kellerman struggled to his feet, using the glass door for support. Elena came to me after that incident on the Meridian Pictures lot. When Tommy Castellano ended up in the hospital, Vincent remembered. A simple car chase sequence that had gone wrong when the stunt driver, Vincent's protege, had missed his mark and slammed into a lighting rig. Castellano had spent 3 days in intensive care with internal bleeding. The kid said you'd been drinking that morning, Kellerman continued. Said you'd insisted on changing the safety protocols at the last minute against his objections. Elena knew because she'd driven you to set. She'd smelled the whiskey on your breath at 8 a.m. and watched you argue with anyone who questioned your judgment. The memory crystallized with unwelcome clarity. Vincent had been drinking that morning, not heavily, just enough to steady his hands after another sleepless night fighting with Elena about money, about his increasingly erratic behavior, about the distance growing between them like a cancer. She was terrified, Kellerman said, not just of you, but of what would happen when someone got killed. Because it wasn't a matter of if anymore, Vincent. It was when. Vincent stood slowly, his movement causing Kellerman to press harder against the glass door. But Vincent walked past him to the window, staring out at the lights of Los Angeles sprawling below like a circuit board in the darkness. So she came to you with a proposal, Vincent said. Document my deterioration, gather evidence, create a safety net for everyone involved. At first, yes. She thought if we had proof of your condition, we could force you into treatment. Stage an intervention backed by legal consequences. Kellerman's reflection in the window showed a man who'd aged decades in the past hour. But then the divorce lawyer got involved, and everything changed. Vincent closed his eyes, remembering Elena's growing distance in those final months, the way she'd started asking innocent questions about his work, his schedule, his plans. How she'd suggested they record their arguments to help us understand our patterns. He'd thought it was couples therapy by proxy. He'd been touched by her apparent desire to save their marriage. The recording from that night, Vincent said softly. Play it. Vincent, I don't think... Play it. The command carried 15 years of accumulated authority, of controlled violence barely held in check. Kellerman's hands shook as he activated the cassette player. Elena's voice filled the room, and Vincent was transported back to that final evening, to the fight that had started over something trivial, unpaid bills or forgotten anniversary he couldn't even remember, and had escalated into something unforgivable. But listening now, he heard something he'd missed in hundreds of previous playbacks. In the background, almost inaudible beneath their shouting, was the sound of a phone ringing. Not their house phone, something else, something Elena had been carrying. She was recording us live, Vincent realized. Broadcasting our fight to someone, to you. Kellerman's silence was confirmation enough. You heard it all happen, Vincent whispered. You heard me kill my wife, and you let her drive away anyway. The tape continued playing, their 15-year-old voices filling the study like ghosts demanding acknowledgement. Vincent heard himself shouting about betrayal, about trust, about the slow poison of a marriage dissolving. But beneath his own rage, beneath Elena's tearful responses, he now detected something else, the faint sound of breathing that wasn't theirs. You were listening, Vincent said, his voice barely above a whisper. You were on the other end of that phone, hearing me threaten her, hearing her beg me to stop drinking, to get help, to remember who I used to be. Kellerman's face had gone the color of old parchment. Vincent, you have to understand. I understand perfectly. Vincent reached over and clicked off the cassette player, plunging the room into a silence that felt like held breath. You heard everything. You heard me grab her. You heard the sound when she hit the kitchen counter. You heard her crying, saying she was bleeding. The producer's mouth worked soundlessly, but Vincent wasn't finished. And you heard me leave, Vincent continued, his tone conversational, almost gentle. You heard me storm out to my workshop to drink myself unconscious, just like I did every night when things got too complicated to face. You heard my wife, alone and hurt and terrified, make the decision to finally run." Kellerman nodded almost imperceptibly, as if the admission was being pulled from him by invisible strings. "But here's what I'm just now understanding," Vincent said, moving to the desk where the scattered documents lay like evidence at a crime scene. He picked up the insurance policy, studying it with fresh eyes. "You didn't try to stop her. You didn't call the police. You didn't even hang up the phone." The terrible recognition was spreading through Vincent's chest like spilled acid. 15 years of guilt, 15 years of carrying the weight of that final violent moment, and suddenly the picture was shifting into a focus that made him dizzy. "You told her to run," he realized. "While she was bleeding and crying and terrified, you told her to take the recording and run, because a dead wife was worth more to you than a divorced one. That's not—" Kellerman started, but his protest died as Vincent held up the insurance document. $2 million, Vincent read again. "Payable on accidental death, but only if there was no evidence of suicide or foul play. Only if Elena died exactly the way she did, alone, in her car, in what looked like a single vehicle accident." The producer's back was pressed so hard against the glass door that condensation from his body heat was forming around his silhouette. "You're wrong. I never wanted her to die. I was trying to help her escape." "Were you?" Vincent's smile was patient, almost paternal, because according to this timeline, you had everything you needed the moment she called you that night. A recording of me at my absolute worst, evidence of domestic violence, proof that Vincent Bronson was exactly the liability you'd been telling everyone he was. He set the document down carefully, as if it might explode. But a recording could be discredited. Witnesses could be bought or intimidated. What you needed was something permanent, something that would destroy my reputation so completely that no one would ever work with me again. The realization hit Kellerman's face like a physical blow. "Vincent, no. You can't possibly think—" "I think," Vincent said softly, "that when Elena called you back from her car, crying and hurt and ready to disappear forever, you saw an opportunity too perfect to waste." The study felt smaller now, as if the walls were contracting with each revelation. Vincent began pacing again, but his movements were different now, not predatory, but almost dance-like, as if he was finally hearing music that had been playing just below his perception for 15 years. "You told her where to meet you," he continued. "Somewhere private, where you could collect the recording and make sure she understood the importance of staying quiet about your arrangement. But you chose the location very carefully, didn't you, Marcus?" Kellerman's breathing had gone shallow and rapid. "She was supposed to survive. The plan was never—" "The plan was always exactly what happened," Vincent interrupted, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had finally solved a puzzle that had been consuming him for half his life. "You told a bleeding, traumatized woman to drive across the city at night while she was in shock, while she was crying so hard she could barely see." The producer's legs buckled, and he slid down the glass door until he was sitting on the floor again. "I loved her too," he whispered, and for the first time, Vincent heard something that might have been genuine grief in the man's voice. The confession hung between them like a blade suspended by a thread. Vincent stared at Kellerman, seeing not his professional rival, but a man who had orchestrated his wife's death out of love, ambition, and the kind of twisted logic that only made sense in Hollywood. "You arrogant bastard," Vincent said quietly. "You actually thought you were saving her." Vincent watched Kellerman crumble against the glass, and for a moment felt something almost like pity. Almost. But the emotion passed like a shadow, replaced by something colder and infinitely more focused. "Saving her," Vincent repeated, tasting the words like poison. He moved to the cassette player and ejected the tape, holding it up to the light as if examining a specimen. "From what, Marcus? From me? Or from the consequences of what you'd both done?" Kellerman's voice came out as barely a whisper. "She was going to tell you. About the recording, about everything. She said she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. So you gave her directions to that industrial district off the 110, Vincent said, his tone clinical now, Surgical, a place you knew she'd never been before. Dark roads, confusing intersections. You told her it was for her safety, didn't you? Away from prying eyes. The producer's head lolled back against the glass, and Vincent saw the exact moment when the last of Kellerman's illusions died. I thought, if she was upset enough, if the roads were challenging enough, maybe there would be an accident. The casual horror of it hit Vincent like a physical blow. 15 years he'd carried the weight of being Elena's killer, and all that time the real architect of her death had been sitting in boardrooms, greenlighting pictures, building an empire on the foundation of calculated murder. But you miscalculated, Vincent continued, setting the cassette down with deliberate care. You expected a fender bender, maybe, something that would leave her shaken but alive, more dependent on your protection. Instead, she hit that barrier at 60 miles per hour. I never meant... Yes, you did. Vincent's interruption was sharp as breaking glass. Maybe not consciously, but some part of you knew exactly what you were doing. A dead Elena was cleaner than a living one. No messy divorce proceedings where she might change her mind about testifying against me. No risk of her developing a conscience about the surveillance. Just a grieving widower destroyed by guilt, and a recording that painted him as an abusive drunk. Kellerman struggled to his feet, his expensive suit hanging on him like a costume 3 sizes too large. The insurance money, I never touched it. It's still sitting in an escrow account. I was going to give it to her sister eventually. Vincent laughed, the sound echoing off the study's mahogany walls. How noble. And I suppose you were also going to eventually tell me the truth about that night? About how my wife died following your directions to meet you in the middle of nowhere while she was bleeding and traumatized? Vincent, please. Please, what? Vincent moved closer, and Kellerman pressed himself harder against the glass door. Please forgive you for murdering my wife. Please understand that it was all for the greater good. Please accept that Elena's death was just collateral damage in your crusade to clean up Hollywood. The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Vincent saw something break behind Kellerman's eyes. Not fear. He'd been afraid for the past hour. This was something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. The understanding that 15 years of justification and rationalization were crumbling in the face of simple, inescapable truth. I destroyed the original recording, Kellerman said suddenly, as if offering a bargain. This is the only copy. You can have it. You can burn it, bury it, whatever you want. Vincent picked up the cassette, feeling its weight. Barely 3 ounces of plastic and magnetic tape that had shaped the last decade and a half of his life. What makes you think I want it destroyed? The question seemed to confuse Kellerman. It's evidence. Proof of what you did to her. What I did. Vincent nodded slowly. Yes, I grabbed her. Yes, I was drunk and angry and said things no husband should ever say. But I didn't kill Elena, Marcus. You did. This recording proves it. He slipped the cassette into his jacket pocket, the movement casual but somehow final. Because anyone listening to this tape will hear what I just heard. They'll notice that phone in the background. They'll wonder who is on the other end, listening to a domestic dispute in real time. And when the phone company records from that night inevitably surface, records I'm betting you thought were destroyed years ago, they'll see a very interesting pattern. Kellerman's face went gray. What pattern? Incoming call to Elena's cell phone at 7:43 p.m., 20-minute duration, originating from your private line. Then a second call from Elena to the same number at 8:15, right around the time this recording ends. Duration, 14 minutes. Vincent's smile was patient, almost grandfatherly. Want to tell me what you two discussed during those 14 minutes while my wife was bleeding in her kitchen? The silence stretched between them like a bridge spanning an abyss. Outside, the party continued its hollow celebration, but in this room, the only sound was Kellerman's increasingly labored breathing. Those were your final instructions, weren't they? Vincent asked softly. Your directions to her doom. Kellerman's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish drowning in air. When he finally found his voice, it came out as a broken whisper. She was crying so hard. Said you'd hurt her, that there was blood. I told her to get in her car and drive to the warehouse district where we could meet safely. Safely. Vincent savored the word like aged wine. You told a woman with a possible concussion to navigate industrial backroads in the dark. You gave her an address in a part of town she'd never seen before, and you did it while listening to her sob about being afraid for her life. I thought I was helping her escape. The words tumbled out of Kellerman now. 15 years of suppressed guilt finally breaching the dam. I had lawyers standing by, safe houses arranged. Elena was supposed to disappear for a few months while we built the case against you. The recording would have been enough to destroy your career, maybe even put you in prison. Vincent moved to the window again, watching his own reflection superimposed over the city lights. In the glass, he looked older than his 58 years, worn down by decades of carrying the wrong guilt. But she never made it to your warehouse, did she? The police called me 3 hours later. Kellerman's voice cracked. Single vehicle accident on Industrial Boulevard. They said she'd been driving erratically, probably fell asleep at the wheel. There were no other cars involved, no witnesses. No witnesses except you. Vincent turned back to face the broken man slumped against the door. You heard her die, didn't you? She called you back one more time. Kellerman's silence was answer enough, but Vincent needed to hear it spoken aloud. He moved closer, his footsteps deliberate on the hardwood floor. Tell me about that final call, Marcus. Tell me what my wife's last words were. She was lost. The confession came out as a sob. Said the roads didn't match the directions I'd given her. She was dizzy, having trouble seeing clearly. I told her to pull over, to wait for me to come get her, but she said she could see headlights behind her and thought you might be following. Vincent felt something cold settle in his chest. I was passed out drunk in my workshop. Those headlights belonged to someone else. I know that now. But Elena was terrified, convinced you'd discovered what we'd been doing. She said she had to keep driving, had to reach the meeting point. Kellerman's breathing grew ragged. I heard her scream. Then the sound of impact. Then nothing. The study fell silent except for the distant murmur of the party beyond the doors. Vincent stood motionless, processing 15 years of misdirected rage and guilt. He'd spent half his life believing himself a killer, when in truth, he'd been the victim of someone else's calculated indifference. You could have saved her, Vincent said finally. In those 14 minutes, you could have told her to drive to a hospital, could have called an ambulance to meet her, could have done anything except send a bleeding woman into Los Angeles traffic with directions to nowhere. I know. Kellerman's admission was barely audible. God help me, I know. Vincent pulled the cassette from his pocket, holding it between them like evidence in a trial that had taken 15 years to convene. This tape doesn't just prove I was an abusive drunk, Marcus. It proves you were listening. It proves you gave her those final directions. And when the authorities start digging into phone records, when they start asking why Elena Bronson was driving to an abandoned warehouse to meet her husband's business rival on the night she died, they'll see it for what it was, Kellerman finished, his voice hollow with defeat. Premeditated murder. Vincent's words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Not the passionate crime of a drunk husband, but the calculated elimination of an inconvenient witness by a man who valued his reputation more than human life. Kellerman struggled to his feet one final time, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. For a moment he looked like he might attempt some final denial, some last desperate justification. Instead, he walked to his desk and picked up a Mont Blanc pen with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "What do you want me to write?" he asked. Vincent watched him for a long moment, seeing not the powerful producer who'd mocked Elena's memory just hours earlier, but a broken man finally facing the true cost of his ambitions. "The truth," Vincent said simply, "all of it. Every phone call, every instruction, every moment you chose your career over my wife's life." As Kellerman began to write his confession in careful, precise handwriting, Vincent felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Not peace, that would take much longer to achieve. But for the first time since that terrible night, the weight pressing down on his chest began to lift. Elena's real killer was finally being held accountable. Vincent stood in the pre-dawn silence of his workshop, the same space where he'd passed out drunk 15 years ago while his wife drove to her death. The confession sat on his workbench like a piece of evidence from someone else's life. 3 pages of Marcus Kellerman's careful handwriting detailing every calculated decision that had led to Elena's murder. The police had been surprisingly gentle when they'd arrived at the mansion 6 hours earlier. Kellerman hadn't resisted, hadn't even seemed surprised when the detective read him his rights. He'd looked at Vincent one final time as they led him away, his mouth opening as if to speak, but Vincent had simply turned his back. Some conversations were 15 years too late. Now, alone with his tools and half-finished projects, Vincent felt the strange sensation of inhabiting his own life again. The workshop looked different somehow. Not the shrine to guilt he'd maintained all these years, but simply a place where a man built things with his hands. Elena's photograph still sat on the shelf above his workbench, but her smile seemed softer now, forgiving rather than accusatory. He'd called her sister from Kellerman's study while they waited for the authorities. Margaret had listened to the entire story in silence, her breathing the only sound on the line. When he finished, she'd been quiet for so long he thought the call had dropped. "I always wondered," she'd finally said. Elena wasn't a reckless driver. She'd never attempt those roads alone at night unless someone convinced her it was necessary. "I'm sorry, Margaret, for everything." "Don't be sorry for the wrong things, Vincent. Elena loved you, even at the end. She was trying to fix what she'd broken." The conversation had lasted another hour, both of them filling in pieces of a puzzle neither had been able to solve alone. Margaret had known about Elena's financial troubles, about the mounting pressure from creditors that had made Kellerman's offer of protection seem like salvation rather than manipulation. Vincent had provided the missing piece. The recording that proved Elena's guilt had ultimately killed her, as surely as the impact with that concrete barrier. Dawn was breaking over the hills now, painting the workshop in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of Elena's hair. Vincent picked up the confession and read it again. Kellerman's neat penmanship chronicling the death of love by degrees. The producer hadn't set out to commit murder, but he'd made each small choice that led to it. The decision to record without consent, to exploit Elena's desperation, to send her into the night when she needed medical attention. The real tragedy wasn't that Vincent had grabbed his wife in a moment of drunken rage. It was that both he and Elena had spent their final months together drowning in secrets, each trying to protect the other from truths that might have saved them both. Vincent's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret, the insurance money. "What do you want to do with it?" He typed back, "Victims Fund for Domestic Violence Survivors." Elena would have liked that. She would have. "Take care of yourself, Vincent." The exchange felt like a benediction, a formal end to 15 years of carrying the wrong cross. Vincent set the phone aside and walked to Elena's photograph, studying her face with eyes finally clear of the fog of misplaced guilt. "I understand now," he said aloud, his voice echoing softly off the workshop walls. "You weren't running from me that night. You were running toward something you thought could fix us." The silence that followed felt different from the oppressive quiet that had haunted him for so long. This was peaceful silence, the kind that came after difficult truths had finally been spoken. Vincent pulled out a piece of sandpaper and began working on a cabinet door he'd abandoned months ago. His hands moved with muscle memory, smoothing imperfections with the patience of someone who finally had time to get things right. The repetitive motion was meditative, grounding him in the present moment rather than the past that had consumed him. As the sun climbed higher, neighbors began their morning routines. Vincent could hear coffee makers gurgling to life, dogs barking for their walks, children arguing over breakfast. The ordinary symphony of life continuing despite tragedy, despite revelation, despite the weight of justice finally served. He thought about Kellerman sitting in a holding cell, probably still writing. More confessions, more attempts to quantify the unquantifiable cost of his ambition. The man would spend years in prison, maybe decades, but Vincent found he felt no satisfaction in that knowledge. Justice and revenge were different animals, and only one of them offered any real peace. By mid-morning, the cabinet door was smooth as glass, ready for staining. Vincent held it up to the light, checking for missed imperfections, and realized he was humming some half-remembered song Elena used to play while she cooked dinner. The melody came easier now, unmarked by the bitter associations that had poisoned his memories for so long. For the first time in 15 years, Vincent Bronson was building something instead of carrying it, and in the golden light of a Los Angeles morning, that felt like the most honest form of mourning he could offer.